Writers are often asked, where do you get your ideas? That's what we're going to talk about tonight. But I'm not just going to tell you about it, I'm going to show you. You might want to grab a notebook. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone. You know, serendipity is a beautiful thing. This past weekend I attended a lecture at the Manchester Historical Society, and I listened to the guest and I was absolutely fascinated, and I gathered up my gumption and I walked up after the presentation and asked her if she would come on the show, and she said yes. Please join me in welcoming Marianne Handley. Marianne, thank you.
I'm so glad to be here.
Glad to be here. I'm just delighted on many, many levels. Now, if you are local to the area, you know that Marianne Handley is the retired senator from Connecticut, and she's also a retired history professor. She was at the Manchester Historical Society speaking about the flu epidemic of 1918. We are, I wouldn't say celebrating is the right word, but acknowledging
commemorating.
That's the better word, 100 years. So I have to tell you, as I was sitting there, now, I went because I'm working on a project, have been for a number of years that takes place during that time period, and I brought my notebook and I'm taking lots and lots of notes because I thought I'll find helpful information. Well, I found so many ideas for other stories, and I was just writing fast and furiously. And at the end, I thought this would be a good news segment for Page One. I don't know a title yet. In fact, maybe you could help me suggest something, but something that has to do with where the ideas come from. So as I talk with Marianne now and we talk about the presentation she made, I want you, if you're writers, avid readers, think about the characters who could come from this information. Think about the potential themes, the conflicts, the settings, the plots that could come from the information that has to do with something that perhaps you wouldn't think would be, that wouldn't be as pregnant with possibilities as talking about a flu epidemic. But you'll see what I'm talking about. So, Marianne, let's start right off the bat. One of the first things that you talked about was that this epidemic in 1918 was not the first. So give us a little historical context.
Well, yeah, there have been, as far as we know in history, 3 major pandemics, which means they're spread all over the place. One was in the 6th century, known as the Plague of Justinian. It was bubonic plague. And then there was the infamous Black Death of the 16th century, which killed maybe 200 million people in Western Europe and in the whole Mediterranean world. The epidemic, the flu epidemic, which was known improperly, but known as the Spanish flu of 1918, was worldwide. Every continent except Antarctica was infected with this plague, and somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died. Every time another group looks at it, they raise the numbers. So it was a major catastrophe.
And of course, here, this 100th commemoration of the Spanish flu of 1918, we just got through a horrific
a bad flu. It's,
right.
It doesn't have the characteristics of the 1918 flu, but it has been a bad one, and it's made people a little nervous about what could be coming. Yeah,
and that's one of the reasons when I listened to what you talked about, I thought, you know, there are all these little pieces that a writer can take from history and perhaps use literary license, perhaps in this case not, but you know, to fashion a story from something that was real. So a couple things that I wanted to draw from some of the factual information. When you talked about these 3 pandemics that we know about, my first thought was, oh, broad canvas for a historical novel. Because I like history, I like novels, I like that big canvas. and life and death themes.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
it
yes.
doesn't get
Yeah.
any bigger than that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how fast the epidemic in the Spanish flu in 1918, let's talk about how fast that moved.
This is one of the unusual characteristics, unlike this spring, this
Yeah.
winter flu, which just keeps hanging on.
Yes.
It lasted, the worst part of it, the most serious part of it, lasted from late August until December. So it's really 3 months and a couple of weeks when it was at its worst. And that was one of the reasons why it was so bad, because people didn't have time to respond. People were dying at the, at the rate of hundreds a day in major cities, and they were just not prepared to deal with death rates of that sort.
And I also think that when people are thinking of any kind of illness, there are certain reasons that we think about winter as a dying season.
Yeah.
But for it to come earlier in the year, there would have been the element of surprise as well.
This was one of the unusual. There was an early version of the flu in the spring of 1918. It was very contagious. It was kind of like the later flu in that it was very contagious, but it was not terribly serious. The death rates were well within the expected rates, but in the fall, it was unusual because it was in the fall, not the winter, and then because of the death rates and the speed of it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things from a storytelling perspective, when I heard you talk about that, I thought, a lot of times, especially in screenplays, maybe not so much in novels, but certainly in screenplays, the idea of having some finite parameters for the story, so that there's a context where you can bookend something that is visible or easily identifiable at the beginning and at the end. And this has that
It certainly
built
does.
right in.
There's a lot of stories of people at the end of the flu talking about how empty their neighborhoods are. Little boys talking about one in New Haven had nobody to play with. It would make a great ending for a very sad story of
And
New Haven flu.
I would want to have another character come in
to join him.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's realistic. That's the thing. So let's talk about how highly contagious it was.
It was very contagious. Viruses are very contagious, and it was extremely contagious. That's why it spread so fast and ended so fast, because flu is a virus, and the virus has to have living cells to keep itself alive. And so they killed all the available cells, so it had to end. Another characteristic of it was the hemorrhaging, which was very unusual in flu, and which caused a problem in diagnosing, because at first they thought maybe it was dengue fever. We would have thought it was Ebola if we saw this today, because of the hemorrhaging. And then the lung congestion, which came on very fast. People were well in the morning and dead by the afternoon.
Literally.
Literally. There was another form of the flu in which people got the flu, seemed to be getting better, and then got pneumonia. So that most of the deaths really came from the pneumonia that followed the flu. But the earlier, more this very quick congestion was really startling and very frightening.
Well, just a minute ago you mentioned that if we were to see this today, we would think, initially because of the hemorrhaging symptoms, we might think Ebola. So one of the things that occurred to me when I heard your presentation, the writer perspective, you start thinking, what if? And what did they know and when did they know it? So I thought about this, and I thought, did the general population know that it was airborne?
They were not sure how it was transmitted. And the main problem with it was that throughout the period, they thought it was a bacterial infection, not a viral infection. So all the research that was being done to try to find a vaccine simply was ineffective, because it wasn't dealing with a virus.
Now, in writing, and I used to teach for 17 years, I taught at the International Women's Writing Guild at their summer conference, and I have a whole course about, how you keep score here in terms of, is the character achieving the goal or not achieving the goal? Is this a step towards it or a step back? And there's all those, plus and minus, and you can see all this wonderful research being done And
Huge
then
amount,
It
everywhere.
seems positive. And then the back step is, but they were researching for bacteria, not virus. So that's the kind of thing that you look at, in creating what you need for a story, for that structure, for that backbone. This is an excellent example.
One in this case, once they decided it was a virus, which was about 1933, among the early people working on the flu virus was Dr. Salk, who came up with the polio vaccine. He switched to polio at some point in his life, but that would also make a very good story of the young Dr. Salk.
Oh yes,
yeah.
and talk then about the backstory, about what led up to that.
Because there was huge battles about among the scientists about the virus, arguing that it was not a virus, and they finally figured out it was.
Well, you could see it because there was so much at stake. What if the information was wrong? I could see people wanting to not only to prove that they were right, not maybe some people were for the power or the glory or the money or the prestige, but I would think most people for knowing that you would benefit mankind, you would do something that made a difference in the world.
Well, the doctor who had discovered the bacteria that was really part of the pneumonia that followed the flu was a highly regarded scientist, and so people were very nervous about challenging him. That was part of the egos of the scientists.
And now there's a character.
Yes,
there's a good
exactly.
character in a story. Somebody whose ego has gotten in the way, or whose ego maybe propels him to do an extra good job or something. And it could go either way. So let's talk about the people who are the population most affected.
This flu's characteristic was unusual because in most flu epidemics, and this winter's flu is the same, very young children whose immune responses are not well developed die, and older people whose immune responses are very tired will die. So it's an upside down bell curve. But in this flu, the major deaths were among healthy young people. So it's a kind of W curve. I mean, young people, very young people did die. Older people, but nowhere near the numbers, did die. It was the 20 to 40-year-olds. And this was in part, and pregnant women were included among that. And then the fact that it was young men in the war this was all during the First World War, who were in camps, who were on trains, who were on boats, who were in the battlefield, all cramped together, meant that they were. They were particularly affected by the flu.
They were in petri dishes. I mean,
50% of the deaths of American soldiers in the First World War were caused by the flu.
50%.
Yeah. And more
amazing.
people died in the flu in the 4 months or so of the flu than have died in all the wars we've been in, including the Civil War. More total population. I mean, the numbers are huge. The numbers are huge. It was just a killer.
I wonder why, generally speaking, we don't know more. I mean, I remember back when I was in high school, and I realize now there probably was a reason. It probably would scare people.
This is a question that historians right now are investigating with great interest, why it has been forgotten and not studied. Part of it was because it was part of the war effort. It occurred during the First World War, and censorship in the First World War was very, very heavy. So no discussion of any bad news in the German press or the French press or the English press or the American press was really allowed, so that this word of the flu was not widely spread. The reason it's called the Spanish flu is Spain was neutral in the First World War, and in Spain the flu came to Spain, as it did everywhere else, and the king got the flu. He lived, but he got the flu. And so people in the newspapers learned little tiny bits about the fact that there was this awful flu in Spain, and the king caught it, so they called it the Spanish flu.
Oh my gosh.
Now, the Spaniards called it the Naples soldier because they blamed it on some Italian soldiers who came into Spain, but that's another matter.
But I can see it. People don't know what's causing it. They've got to put blame somewhere because then they think that they can fix it.
Right. Well,
somehow.
there's always the hope. Yeah.
Well, no, there had to have been also a lot of collateral death.
Yes, and these were particularly awful because of the fact that it was young, healthy adults who died. These were the parents of children. And so I've never seen any figures of this, but the numbers of orphans left by the flu were very high, and the numbers of single parents who remarried, because even in the 20s, people really could not manage a household without a man and a woman in the house, who remarried and maybe didn't marry as happily as they might have because they were under pressure to bring it. So the orphan children were deeply troubled by it, and there were a lot of deaths in large households where the mother and father might be ill and unable to care for the kids, so the kids died. In Alaska, a great many children simply died of hunger because the parents weren't well enough to provide food. Yeah.
And you just mentioned something that and again the little light goes on, and I'm thinking like that mental quarry, where you put all the ideas, like if I can't use it now, maybe I'll use it later. But that idea that but that people did marry in haste for practical reasons, not necessarily happy marriages.
And a lot, the few accounts, Mary McCarthy's account of her Catholic girlhood, I think she calls it, her memoir, is directly related to the fact, the misery she had was directly related to the fact that her mother and father died, and she was put into an aunt's house who didn't really want her, and she had a pretty miserable childhood. So, yeah.
All right. Populations with high incidence, populations with low incidence, was it evenly divided? How did that go?
Well, if you look around the world, the people living in the developing countries had much higher rates. For example, India, the Indian population was heavily hit. In the United States, for some reason that has not been figured out, African Americans had a lower death rate than might have been expected considering their population and living arrangements. But on the other hand, Italian immigrants had a higher death rate than any other immigrant group. And again, there are some explanations, but nobody's exactly sure. But they are kind of curious.
Yeah, they are.
Curious phenomenon. Yeah.
And that begs the whole idea too, in terms of story. What if? If you're the writer, how do you create a story that reflects that that information?
Yeah.
And all right, I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit, Marianne. One of the things that let's tie right into the effect on an African American, a black population. So here's World War I. All the young doctors, nurses are being drafted or they're volunteering. What about the black population?
The black population was largely not allowed to serve in the black population of people who were doctors and nurses were not allowed to serve in the U.S. Army. It was a highly segregated army at that time. There were black soldiers, there were black people serving in the military, but not as nurses or doctors. So they played a fairly important part, black doctors and nurses, in the response at home to the flu. And one of the places where we begin to see a little bit more respect for professional black African Americans is among doctors and nurses because of the work they did in the flu. It has,
Yeah.
I mean, there's always some good to come out of something, out of
Absolutely.
everything. So
Absolutely.
it wasn't a lot, but nonetheless, there is some indication.
But you see change.
Yeah, yeah.
And of
And
course,
in
you
a
know,
right direction.
yes.
Yeah.
And from a story perspective, that was one of the things that occurred to me when you were touching on
Yeah.
this the other day at the Historical Society, and I thought, okay, so there's a character in the story who is an African American doctor, an African American nurse, or a member of the family of an African American
Yeah.
doctor or nurse. And now, then you think of all the other kind of characters who would be negative in some way,
Yeah.
from absolutely outright villainous to just irritating or,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
certainly bigoted. And then what happens when the only good care available comes from someone that you've looked down on?
Yeah, right.
It's like, oh, you
and
can
who
see
saves your life,
and
probably.
saves your life.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
that's a really good
Yeah.
part. You touched on a minute ago about the propaganda and how countries would not publicize how bad things were.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned something at the Historical Society about information in the newspapers, a newspaper here locally, the advice.
Oh, to be cheerful.
The advice to be
I mean,
cheerful.
it's an absolute riot, and it's not just once. I looked at the Herald for the fall of 1908, the Manchester Herald, and there's several small pieces in what might be an early sort of op-ed page saying, there's been a lot of sickness around. It was not until late identified as the flu, but there's been a lot of sickness, and one of the ways to prevent the flu is to be cheerful and happy and sing.
And sing.
Yes. So that was the.
Yeah.
It was just part of the unwillingness to accept the reality of how serious this whole thing was.
Well, I wondered too, depending on the way the story might go, could you have a story where the publisher of a paper wanted to be sure that newspapers were sold, and it's like, okay, here's the cure. You be happy and you be cheerful and you sing. And what if there's a young string reporter who's actually seeing what's going on and hearing talk among other people and knowing, no, it's much worse than that,
Yeah.
and trying to get the word out. So, of course, this was back, 100 years ago.
Yeah,
So many
exactly,
things, ways of
100 years ago.
communication we
Yeah.
don't have now. But that to me set up right away. You've got conflict, you've got really interesting characters,
right,
all
right,
sorts
yeah.
of things.
Yeah.
The whole idea of the town leaders taking over.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I want to do right now is we're gonna pop up a picture. There's when I was down at the Historical Society, I took a picture of one of the members of the Cheney family. That's
Yeah,
a big
Dorothy,
prominent
yeah,
family
yeah.
in Connecticut. They had the big mills, the
Yeah,
Cheney
right,
silk
yeah.
mills. And one of the daughters, Dorothy, and here's her picture now.
Yeah.
So
She went to France.
all right, so tell us a little bit about, so she was not a nurse initially.
No, she was not. She was an amateur. She was a volunteer.
Yeah.
She went to France. She'd never been had any nursing training, but she was a volunteer in a Red Cross hospital. She and her sister, I think, went. There were two Cheneys. I'm not sure whether it was another sister. There were 50 students from Smith who were in the same group from Smith College, who also went. They were not trained nurses, but what was really needed with the flu, and still is TLC. You
Yes.
really just need to keep people warm and comfortable,
Hydrated.
and make sure they have enough water, that they're hydrated. And that's what they trained these young women to do. I mean, it broke their hearts in many ways, because the guys they were caring for in the night, one night they'd come back and they'd be dead.
And they'd be dead.
This was very, very, very painful, because they weren't trained nurses. They weren't trained to be, not that nurses ever or doctors ever accept death of their patients,
No, but you compartmentalize
but
it.
you learn to cope with it.
Yes.
They had a lot of trouble coping with it. Yeah.
All right, so right off the bat, I'm thinking, now here's an interesting character. In fact, any of you like me, who are huge Downton Abbey fans, and I remember
that's right.
Sybil
Yeah.
in the story, and then she volunteers.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole idea of, as in Downton Abbey, where they open up the home
Yeah.
as a recuperating place for
Right.
officers. But I know here, here in town, there was a question of opening up the poorhouse.
Well, they opened Cheney Hall.
Okay.
Cheney Hall was open in October, had 28 beds, 3 nurses and, what do we have? 3 nurses and 2 orderlies and doctors coming in and out. And they had 72 patients in the 6 weeks that they were there,
My
of
gosh.
which 15 died. So it's a quarter of the patients
Wow.
did not survive. So they were the very sickest who were sent there. And they talked about, if it hadn't waned, opening the poorhouse as another place to, because there was no hospital in Manchester at the time.
And that's one of the things, the hospital came out of it. One
Right.
of the other things I found fascinating was, because the local leaders are looking at what's going on nationally and going, this isn't working, we need to do something
Yeah.
ourselves. And that idea of making sure that students who are learning how to cook in school, the home ec students, suddenly
Did
they're
Meals
doing
on
meals.
Wheels. Yeah, yeah.
They're cooking for everybody.
In the larger cities, the same thing happened, and they divided the towns, the cities, into wards, almost like the old political
Yeah.
wards, and groups of people were assigned.
Like Meals on Wheels.
In Philadelphia, that broke down. Most places it held up, but in Philadelphia, even that broke down because it was so bad.
We only have about 2 minutes
Yeah.
left, believe it or not.
Okay.
And one of the things I wanted to bring up was the fact that, when we think about, the flu was over eventually, when it was over and everything, everything's fine. And it wasn't fine. When you talked about the sleeping sickness
Yeah.
as an after effect, tell us a little bit about what that
There's
was.
not much, I haven't found much about it, except in a couple of cases, a couple of studies have mentioned that it seems to have been this encephalopathy, and it has another name to go with it, seems to have been a result of the flu. And I know, for example, my father had it in the 1920s. And
But you think about that. Think about depression.
yes, and depression was
setting in.
Yeah.
And you would think, well, of course it would. If you've gone through something like that and you've lost your family and
Right.
all the
And there's-
members of your
in
town.
some cases, survival guilt. I mean, there's a lot of
Oh, I
a lot of
imagine.
factors, a
I
lot of
imagine.
factors there. Yeah.
Marianne, I have to tell you, because I have so much stuff I want to ask you about.
Well, that's
We've-
all right. It's a big topic.
It
Yeah.
really is.
Yeah.
So you know what I'm going to do? Let me tell you and the viewing audience. If you're listening to this, certainly you can watch the interview again on YouTube, but also here at some point in the future, and we don't have a date yet, but Marianne's presentation at the Manchester Historical Society was taped, and it will be available, as well. You can write to me. I'll put a notice out.
I think it's going to be in May. I think it's going to be shown in May. I think
Okay,
so. Yeah.
that's good to know. And I would love to know from all of you, if you'd like to write to me, zita@zitatv.com, what ideas you got from this, whether it's the formation of a certain character or a plot or a theme, anything that you're thinking of in terms of hearing this piece of history, and also whether or not you like this idea of a segment called, where do the ideas come from? And on that, Marianne Handley, thank you very, very much.
Oh, I'm happy to be
For
here.
being
This
on
was
the
fun.
show.
It
Thank
was
you.
fun.
And my thanks to the crew, and also my thanks to you in the viewing audience. I love to close the Page One show with a quote from the late Ursula Le Guin, who said, "There have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories." So find your story, find a way to tell it. Join us again next time. Thank you.
Food for the crew and guests is provided by Manchester Grill of Manchester, Connecticut, and Angelo's Restaurant of Glastonbury, Connecticut. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email Zita at zitatv.com or write to Zita Christian, Page 1 TV, P.O. Box 1515, Manchester, Connecticut 06045-1515. You can watch this and other episodes of Page One on youtube.com/Zita3x3.